long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, hey guys, that was just a short clip from Reverend Martin Luther King, and I'm so excited that you're here with me for our virtual museum. I'm going to start off with the history of the Black church in the 1800s. So this guy is Richard Allen. He was born February 14th, 1760, and died March 22nd, 1851. Fun fact, a way to remember his birthday is his birthday was on Valentine's Day, February 14th. And the reason why the reason why he's here is because he was a minister, educator, writer, and one of America's most active and influential Black leaders. He founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1794, which is known now as like the AME Church. It's a predominantly Black church and a Black denomination. Richard Allen was a slave, but he converted to Christianity and became a minister, and that became his platform for social justices and freedom for slaves. Here we have a picture, logo for the AME Church. Richard Allen really made a huge impact on African slaves determined to be set free and finding their freedom and finding their voice and giving them the space, which was in a church that looked just like this one, AME Church, to be able to speak and to be able to talk about politics and to be able to talk about things that they were dealing with as African slaves. So here we have a book, a biography, Freedom's Prophet, about Richard Allen. If you have the opportunity and the time to go and look in this book, this is a book that's very informative that I would suggest each and every person to go read about, and gives you things that he dealt with in the Black church. Freedom Prophet is more than a fine biography of Richard Allen. It tells a dramatic story of the role of the Black church and its leaders in the African American struggle in Philadelphia and other northern communities against Southern slavery and for place of equality in America during the early decades of nationhood. This compelling study joins the first ranks of the recent work that has profoundly expanded our understanding and information of African American community in pre-Civil War America. Identity in Pre-Civil War America, that was written by James Oliver, a person who read the book, an author of Hope in Liberty. So if you have the opportunity, again, I would take a look in this so you can make those connections between the Black church and what it did for Africans and African slaves prior to the Civil Rights era. And it's just interesting to learn about Richard Allen's story and how he impacted change. So here we are, the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival in the United States from 1795 to 1835. Many slaves were converted to the Christian faith, like Richard Allen, which led a lot of African Americans, Black slaves at that time, to their knowledge and ability to read and their access to freedom. A lot of abolitionists came from the Second Great Awakening. Their mindsets and their beliefs had changed to people being equal and being treated equally. And right here you see a visual of what took place at the Second Great Awakening. So this was kind of like a revolutionary revival for Protestants, coming into the knowledge and revelation of what God really wanted for his people. So this was a good thing for slaves, and it was a good thing for Black people. So moving forward, here comes the fun part. We're going to talk about the civil rights era. We're going to connect the past prior to the civil rights era and slavery to what happened during the civil rights era and how impactful the Black church was for the movement and how it could change society today. We're going to try to make those connections. So here, our next picture is of a warrior. I would say a mighty fighter who fought in the Civil War. Okay, so the Civil War, the American Civil War was a civil war in the United States from 1861 to 1865. Fought between northern states loyal to the Union and southern states that had seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Okay, so you can see here on this map how the Union states were blue, they were north, and the Confederate states were purple, and they are southern states. And this Civil War happened on American soil. They call it one of the bloodiest wars that took place. Okay, so in this next picture, we're going to talk about some monumental changes that happened after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. These amendments are called the Civil War Amendments that happened right after the Civil War. They're designed to ensure equality for recently emancipated slaves. The 15th Amendment prohibited governments from denying U.S. citizens the right to vote based upon race, color, past, and servitude. So this was a good thing for African Americans. They felt they were liberated, they were free, but some people had a lot of issues with that. A lot of Caucasian people or white people in southern states did not want to really relinquish their power. So then they created something called the Jim Crow laws. So the Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in southern states. And even though they were enforced laws in southern states, up north, they still dealt with a lot of segregation, a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice, and a lot of racism. Right here, you see a picture of the colored waiting room. Segregation was so prominent. The African American daily life and living. They weren't given the same equal opportunities. They weren't able to go to certain areas and sit. They weren't able to sit on certain places in the bus. And if they were sitting down at those places, they would have to stand up. If white people entered the bus, they weren't allowed to get on certain pools, drink out of certain water fountains, go to different schools. It was just a lot of tension in America and a lot of separation amongst people and their color and their race. So this was a hard time for African Americans. So here you see a picture of World War II. So you've noticed that we've jumped really quickly. We have not hit everything that happened during this time, but some prominent things that happened that will connect the past Black church to the civil rights era and the Black church. So when we're talking about World War II, we're talking about a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. You had a lot of slaves, African Americans, they were not slaves, they were free, but they were not allowed to get as many opportunities as white people in America. So even though they were free, they didn't get equality, right? That fought in the war in World War II. And they felt when they came back home and after they fought that war and dealt with prejudice and racism during the war, they had to come back to America and still deal with those same things, which gave them this sort of boldness that said, like, you know what? We're not going to take this. We're not going to deal with this. And then what else? Other things that ignited that fire within them was the deadly killing of a 14-year-old Emmett Till, a black boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955. He was accused of offending a white woman, and his mother decided to have an open casket viewing for everyone to see what these Caucasian men or white men did to her son, and how black people were treated awful in southern states, and just even across America. They were treated awful because of the color of their skin, and if they did not obey or follow these rules, then physical force, death, lynching, things that were just deadly were enforced. And that's the sad part, that because they didn't follow these laws, they weren't just arrested, they were being killed and lynched. And that's the part that is gut-wrenching. So on top of all of the hatred and crime that was happening to African Americans, we got a little breath of fresh air with the Brown versus Board of Education, a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the court ruled the U.S. state laws, racial segregation of schools, are unconstitutional. So young African American and black kids and white kids were able to go to get school together. They were integrated and afforded the same opportunities to be educated. So for African Americans,
this up and down roller coaster,
so
we can do this.
We can do
situation
much more,
with Rosa Parks, who
we at
was
least
known
have
as the
someone
mother
on
of
our
the civil
side.
rights movement,
Then
was
right
arrested
after that,
for not giving a
down
proceed to a white passenger in 1955, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. So, Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP, and she was a woman who believed that she deserved equality and she deserved to be able to sit wherever she wanted to sit on a bus when she pays for it, right? So here we're going to take a look at the bus that this took place on, and these buses look really nice, really cool, right? But this is the place where Rosa Parks was not afforded the opportunity to take a seat. So she was not able to take a seat where she wanted. So moving forward, African Americans, black people collectively came together. And this is the part where the church became another pivotal place for African Americans. Black people congregated together in black institutions like the church, the AME Church, the Baptist Church, and they worked together to come up with a plan. And the plan that they came up with was the Montgomery bus boycott. And guess who was the face of that protest, that boycott beyond Rosa Parks? It was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a minister, a reverend at that time, who was an eloquent speaker, who was very strategic, very thoughtful, and had a purpose in how he approached civil injustices in America. And his approach was nonviolence. And a lot of the meetings that they had and that African Americans had together collectively were inside of churches again. And Martin Luther King became such a pivotal and monumental figure for the civil rights movement because of his nonviolent protest. Now you have some people who feel that, well, that's not the way I feel that they should have dealt with, the injustices that were happening in society. But for Martin Luther King and people who protest and rallied with him, they thought this was the best way. And notably, this way allowed him to get the access and get the ear of so many white people and other different races. So it was somewhat effective, and it did play a role in how we as African Americans are able to come together and to vote and to walk freely and to get water and to be able to live where we want to live, even though there's still systemic racism. Martin Luther King played a huge role and made a huge impact in the changes that we have seen thus far. So the reason why I chose to speak about him and make that connection about the church is because his views and his philosophy and his principles all were biblical based. They were pretty much saying, love one another, try to listen to one another. Let's try to, be above them and to, not fight anger with anger, but with love. and to make a difference. And a lot of the things that he spoke on, and a lot of his speeches were speeches that took place in the church that had biblical references, that talked about his faith and who he believed in and why he believed in them, and why he believed in the God that he believed in. And so this led to a boldness amongst the African American community. They believe that with their faith, just like Richard Allen, and with the God that they serve and the Bible that they read, that these injustices were not biblical and they were not a part of what they believed the Lord or God sent them on earth for. So although many Christian believers or people of different faiths might not have agreed with Martin Luther King's tactics, and some people still believe that he could have done more, he still made an impact in society as one of the well-known and greatest activists, civil rights activists known to man. And also, a lot of churches did not support him. That's one thing to understand, that a lot of churches felt like our purpose is not to fight for political issues and freedom and change, but simply just to teach the gospel. But Martin Luther King believed his purpose here was different, and that he had a job, he had an assignment, he had a purpose to fulfill, which was to help impact society by allowing people of different race and different creeds to come together and speak to one another. And one of the most impactful speeches that everyone knows of and everyone speaks of is the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington, where they marched collectively and people came together and they heard Martin Luther King speak so eloquently about the racial injustices and how his hope is that we can come together as one to make a difference and make a change. And I believe that Martin Luther King's tactics, or I believe that his logic or theories or principles are what allowed him to be able to get the ear of so many different people. And to this day, Martin Luther King is still being celebrated in elementary schools, although there are many more people that played a role in civil changes in society. He was one that was well known. So again, even though there was a lot of different components that impacted the civil rights movement and the civil rights war, one component that I focused on during this visual museum is the Black church, and made that connection from Richard Allen in the first AME church to Martin Luther King, who made a stance and made a difference with different protests and I Have a Dream speech. And the church was one place that we all know that Black people still congregate together to this day and work together to be educated on things that are happening in society, things that are taking place with our culture, Black culture, and things and policies that could and should be changed. So I hope you enjoyed my visual museum, and that these pictures and this information that you learned today can help you to make that connection on what can we do in society and places that we can congregate in to actually work together to make a change with social injustices that are happening today. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.
I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. Oh, yes, I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now, I'm faltering, I'm losing my courage. I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weaken, losing my courage, they will begin to get weak. Seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even unto the end of the world.